So my name is Chris Bischoff, and I am the regional consultant for the North Central region. This is a picture of Kurt Russell because, you know, I figured folks would rather see him than me anyhow. Um, People my age remember Kurt Russell was the hero of all the Disney movies back in the 70s. Anyway, I've been with the Department for Libraries and Archives since 2000. In the year 2000, I started as the construction consultant working with public libraries all across the state. And I got that job because, in addition to being a librarian and having a library degree, I grew up doing construction. My family is all in construction, so I've worked with my dad and my uncle who were plumbers. I worked a lot with my brother-in-law who's an electrician. So I've had my boots in the mud my whole life, and that's how I fell into the construction niche. In 2015, when I started as a regional consultant, we, over a period of time, restructured how the construction grants and construction questions were handled. So our construction grant program is managed by our grants administrator, and I held on to the bricks and mortar type construction questions just because I'm a construction geek and I love all of it. So that's why I am here today. I have a bit of a cold, so I might be pausing for a second to get a drink of water or get a cough drop, so I won't be hacking too much. So we'll move along. Before we begin, remember that I'm very happy to assist as you work through the planning and construction process, so you can call anytime. When you're doing construction, especially because it usually involves significant amounts of money, you want to think really long term. You don't want to do a project and then a year or two later say, oh, I wish we'd done this bit more or this a little bit differently. We encourage folks to start by obtaining 20-year population projections for your county and to start developing an idea of the long-term space needs for your library. So whatever project you do will be moving you towards that long-term goal. It can be helpful to consider age, gender, and other breakdowns within your community. You can use KDLA standards to create square footage benchmarks. So if you have a certain amount of population, there's a factor you can use to multiply, and it gives you a starting place for a target for building size. This website, as the last time I checked, it's being rebuilt, but I am hoping that this ksdc.louisville.edu website will continue to be the Kentucky State Data Center. That's the official census information for the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and you can go there to get projections. As you get started, you want to know what it is you want to do. So an important first step is listing the functions to be included in your improved facility. Any key staff and yourself should start a list either on paper or as a computer document, just listing all the things that you want your new building to do. So we need a new meeting space. We need small meeting rooms are one of the common ones. Little study rooms for 2 to 4 people are really becoming a hot item. Improve team space, coffee, informal gathering spaces, et cetera, et cetera. Just list all that stuff down so that you're able to explain what it is your new building needs to do. Our main program today is going to look at architect hiring and then also some preliminary design work with that architect once they've been hired. So just some general information about hiring an architect. Please hire someone who has experience designing Kentucky public libraries. Library design is a specialized process. You don't want to have to train your architect in library construction. The reason is there are things that affect the library design. There are things about library work that affect how the library should be designed. And if you hire an architect who is experienced, working in Kentucky and understands public libraries, they'll understand our workflow, space relationships, needed sight lines, etc. So when you're sitting at the circulation desk, you need to be able to have a view of the teen area, hopefully, the entrance to the children's area, which should be a different space, and also possibly be able to supervise the entrance to the local history room. Things like that. It's helpful if you have an experienced architect. They already understand how our work operates. Be sure to hire an architect that is a good fit with your library regarding temperament and management style. Process-wise, you are not required to bid for an architect. Your board can determine that they want to hire directly. And, I avoid even calling it a bid process, because when you talk about bidding, people assume it's going to be a formal bid advertisement with a formal bid opening, and it's really going to be focused all about the cost. Your library will want to have more flexibility, and because it's a professional service, you're not required to use a formal bid process. So we'll talk about how your board might want to manage. As far as who you can hire, your board can look at an architect you've previously worked with. You could hire somebody that's done other libraries you like. And the most common and probably the best way is to hire using an interview process. Please do not have a design contest. Having a design contest can lessen board control over whom you hire and how the facility will function. You want your library to be designed very collaboratively as a process between the architect and the firm and your library and your staff. There needs to be a lot of back and forth. So you don't want to give a huge part of the design away to somebody who may not have had much experience with your library yet. It's most typical to start by having a request for qualifications. Excuse me. An RFQ, or request for qualifications, typically includes these things. Similar to the concern about having a design competition, it's best not to ask for a layout of the library as part of the RFQ process. Again, because you don't want to put the architect in the position of having to design your library before they've been able to interact with you and your staff sufficiently. Also, it can really change the opinion, and I don't think it's always for the better. I've attended architect interviews on more than one occasion where a sample design was requested and the decision was made all about that design, when in reality, any architect that's worth their salt will be happy to and want to collaborate with you and alter the design to make it work for you. So it kind of puts the architect in a bind to try and guess what the library is going to want, how they're going to want their building to work before they've had time to get to know you and your staff and your situation. After you receive the RFQ information, and you can request directly from any architects, particularly that you really want to meet, or if there's somebody you're very hopeful about, make sure you include them and get their information. It's common to poll other libraries and find out who they liked and get information from other firms. And if you can narrow it down to 2 to 3 firms, that's probably best, because the interviews can be pretty involved. When you're interviewing architects, it's most typical for each firm to get about an hour, 30 minutes to do a general presentation and 30 minutes for discussion. Then schedule 15 minutes between each interview so that the architects can switch out any note papers, or they might have tripods with drawings or pictures or photographs or whatever. and let the board can go to the bathroom and get a drink between times. Make sure when you're doing architect interviews that you interview the designer and the construction administrator who you will actually work with. Some big firms will also bring in, principal architects, like their names on the firm. They might bring sales staff. They might bring a lot of other people. There's nothing wrong with all of that. But you definitely want to interview the person that's going to lay out your building. And you definitely want to interview the construction administrator who will be supervising the construction once the work begins. Those to me are the two big people that you definitely don't want to miss talking to. You can always contact me or other libraries to get example questions that you might ask on the discussion part of the interview. So it's not surprising that the answers can be long, so probably even 4 or 5 questions, maybe 6 if some of them are pretty easily answered, would take up 30 minutes because, again, it will be a conversation. After you've done the interviews, it's often helpful to create a ranking paradigm and rank the firms after each presentation. So you might have items such as you like their design, their cost, their answers about working with library boards, their history, whatever, rank them 1 to 5. And that can help create a little bit more objective rubric if you want to do that. Determine which firms are qualified to work with your library, and then select by feel. I'm going to go back. The reason that I think it's important to focus on having an architect firm that your board and especially the director are going to understand each other and get along well is construction's a long process. We'll talk some more about this in a minute, but it's very important that you get along with and really trust the architect. Okay, things are going to be involved. Sometimes there are going to be little issues that arise, so you really want to feel good about who you're hiring and not just go with the firm that has the lowest fee or some other thing like that. After the board has selected an architect, it is most common to use standard AIA architectural agreements. This is an example. It's probably not the current year. I think it was redone in 2013 and has maybe been redone since then. But anyway, the American Institute of Architects has standard contract documents that are most typically used. Architect fees are typically around 7 to 8% of the construction cost. Many architects are also willing to negotiate a flat fee. Typically, it would be around 7 to 8% of the construction cost, but if you set it as a flat fee, then you can predetermine what that fee will be, and if you have changes to the project up or down, then you've already constrained that one cost factor. The fee should, as I said, probably not be the primary determining factor. A 0.5% one way or another, it's a lot of money to you or me, but when you're looking at a building that's probably going to cost $3 million and more and have a lifespan of 50 to 70 to 100 years, you don't want to be overly focused on saving a few dollars at the front end if you feel like you'll get a better product by spending a little bit more on your design fee. Finally, be sure to have your library's lawyer review the contract. Okay, now that you've hired your architect, we'll talk just a little bit about working with architects. First off, it's imperative to remember the architect works for the library. They are paid by the library. They are there to represent the interests of the library, and you don't want to be strutting around lording it over them. But if you don't want to let aesthetic features or something like that take precedence over what the library needs to have to function as a library. As it says here, one role is for the architect to protect the library's interest. They are your consultant. I think it's best to nurture mutual respect. I think these things are also true for working with the contractors. You want to honor their knowledge and experience, but you also want to remember that you have expertise doing library work. It's good to be respectful of people's time. They have multiple projects usually at any given time. So expect to get the help and the answers you need, but remember they have a lot going on. So things might need a little bit more lead time than you'd hope. Again, you want to balance making sure that the library's interests are protected, because you're paying the architect a lot of money to do that, but there might be times where it might take a day or so for them to get back to you. So just try and be cognizant of that. It's important to be aware that problems will occur. When you're doing a big construction project like this, it's more or less impossible to have things go perfectly from the very beginning to the very end. It's just too complex of a process. So you need to know that problems will occur, but you can work for and expect the resolution of those problems. Sometimes those resolutions may require extra funds. Sometimes they don't, but it's just something to be prepared for and to have in your budget. Your architect will help you create a budget and have a little bit of a, usually there's a 5% contingency fee to help make up for things like that. All right, I believe in the coffee cup principle. Architects like to build things, so do contractors. A cup of coffee and a reasonable attitude will do a lot to help keep things moving slowly. Again, you want to stay focused on function, and you do not want to hesitate to say what you think. You understand libraries, you know what your building needs to do, but keep it friendly, listen to their input. The architect will have a lot of experience about designing and building structures, so they will also have things to bring to the table, and you want to balance both of those. All right, this is a random picture. I like to do this just to take a little bit of a break, make sure that anybody that has a question, they can put that in the chat. This little candle sconce I saw when I was visiting the Lizzie Borden house in Fall River, Massachusetts, and I thought it was so cool. I've never been able to find one. I've hoped to find one on eBay someday so I could put one in my house, because that's so neat. All right. We are not seeing any questions coming through so far. Don't hesitate. As you can see, between my photographs and my hacking and coughing, I like to keep things a little bit down home. So don't hesitate to holler if you have a question. All right, let's talk a little bit about design stages. So once you've hired your architect and you start the process of designing your building, it happens in a variety of stages, which are very typical across construction projects. A couple of background things first. It's important always to make sure that you know what you're talking about when you're talking about construction costs, because it's easy to confuse what I call a construction cost, meaning that's how much you're paying the contractors to build your physical space, versus the total project cost. The total project cost is everything plus the construction. There are a couple of big things that are part of the total project cost that you must account for, because there's 6-figure elements. So of course your construction cost is going to be the most expensive thing, but if you're building a whole new building, the architect fees would probably range $150,000 or more. Furnishings would be a similar amount. So you need to account for all of those things when you're doing the planning for your building, and make sure that when you're talking about various costs that you know what it is you're discussing so you can compare them correctly. Architects tend to talk about the construction cost, but they will also maintain a budget for you that includes all the what they call soft costs. So that would be fees you're paying to like a surveyors for special inspections, furniture, their own design fee, all of that stuff. They'll help track it, but you do need to make sure that you know what you're talking about when you're talking about various construction costs. As you go through the design phases, you will only pay for the amount of the design phase, the amount of design that has been completed after it's been approved by the board. So we're going to see those phases coming up next, and you'll pay set percentages for each design phase as you go along. Remember, be sure to say what you think from the very beginning. Every once in a while, I've worked with libraries that were a little bit reticent, and the architect should not and probably does not want you to be shy. They want this building to work for you. The library designers that are commonly working in Kentucky, they are artistic, but they also have a great understanding of how our libraries operate, and they really do have an interest in providing a building that's going to function. So you can't hold back and be shy. The other thing to remember is, as the design progresses through the stages that we're getting ready to discuss, it becomes harder to implement any changes. All right, so some of this we've already touched on, but as you're preparing to hire an architect, you know, there are things that kind of come before you even really start. Sometimes the architect will help do this initial planning even before they start doing drawings. So again, you want to think long term. You want to determine the needed functions of the new building. Try to focus on library function, less on styling, etc. It's going to be easy for your board and for the architect to spend a lot of time on style elements, and there's nothing at all wrong with that. We are lucky in Kentucky to have a diversity of beautiful libraries all around the state in every corner, but it's easier to focus on that stuff, and sometimes it can be a little bit harder to stay focused on how the building will function. So that's going to be a refrain you keep hearing from me, is to focus on the library function. The initial planning can sometimes be folded into the schematic design phase. Sometimes you can work with an architect on a separate contract to do a little bit of early planning, and that could range anywhere from $8,000 to $25,000 depending on what all is involved. One advantage to doing it as a separate contract before you hire the architect that's going to do the full design, if you have somebody you like but you want to do a little bit of a trial period, you can do that as a separate contract to do that initial pre-planning, and then if you like them, then you can just hire them to take over for the full schematic design. And sometimes you can even get a bit of a discount for what you've already paid on the schematic design part if you go with the same firm. All right. The schematic design is the first main phase of a library design or any building design. It determines the basic layout. So you have the basic relationship of spaces. It usually results in a simple floor plan and a preliminary design for the front facade. With modern computerized drafting, a lot of times we're starting to see schematic design include a little bit more than would typically be in the schematic phase, but I like to think of schematic design more as a line drawing because it's intended to be very flexible and still be able to be easily modified as needed. The fee for schematic design, once it's completed and accepted by the board, would typically be 20% of the total design cost. The fees may vary from firm to firm, but these are typical. Schematic design is a good stopping point if you don't actually have the funding for construction. It's very common for Kentucky Public Libraries to hire an architect and start doing a schematic design as a way to figure out how they're going to pay for their whole building. It's extremely common, and there's nothing at all wrong with it. The trick is, if you do not have funding to actually pay for your building, this is where you want to stop design until you have the funding for construction. Schematic design can be put on the shelf and sit there and then you pull it off a year from now, 5 years from now, whenever you're ready to actually finish the design and start the building. But you don't want to go farther than that, because you don't want to overinvest in a building that you don't yet know how you're going to pay for, and especially because the codes all change. So the fire code changes every couple of years. The electrical code can change every couple of years. The building code, ADA, all of those things change on various time frames. And if you've designed your building, you may have to go back and pay to have it redesigned because you waited too long and something changed in the interim. So it's totally common to pay, $25,000 to maybe $40,000 or more for a schematic design, and then take a pause, possibly for several years while you're figuring out funding. But please, it's best not to go beyond that. The schematic design is also a good point if you're going to work with a furniture vendor, because the furniture vendor can bring a lot of experience doing library layout, so they can have helpful comments on the building design as it goes along, and even things like blocking that you can put in walls to attach shelving or conduit for various pieces of furniture or whatever. This this picture shows the Owen County Public Library. It's a little bit, was done with a computer, so it actually shows wall thicknesses and things like that a little more than, it's not just a line drawing, but it gives you an idea that it's a very simple layout in the front facade of the building. The next stage after schematic design is design development. At this point, in a typical setting, wall thicknesses would be shown, basic HVAC questions and utility locations will be considered. The drawings will go from being 3 or 4 pages, maybe at most, to being 10 or 20 pages. And once you have worked through the design development phase and your library board has accepted that work, the fee for that element is typically about 15%. Then the final design phase, where you're actually laying out the building, is called construction documents. During construction documents, the complete set of plans and specification books are prepared for bidding. At the end of this phase, you'll have a giant roll of blueprints that'll probably be 50 or 60 pages thick, and 2 or 3 big specification books that are like an old-fashioned phone book, if anybody remembers what that is. It'd be, usually it's a ring-bound document of probably 200 pages per book or something like that. At this point, there's been so much coordination between the mechanicals and the electrical and the layout, all of that engineering. There are a lot of things that have been coordinated to get to this point. So it's a lot harder to make changes at the construction document phase than it is earlier on. That's why you don't want to wait before you share your opinion. Of course, if something comes up, it's going to be better to change it now before you actually start building the building, but it's going to be a lot more involved if you're making a substantial change. So to move an outlet may not be hard at all. To move a door or a window or something like that could be well nigh impossible or affect a whole lot of other parts of your building. This is a sheet from a full-on construction documents, and even my screen's small. Your screen is probably too small really to be able to make out any of this, but you can see there are lots of markings that are showing a whole lot of detail on how your building is going to be built. The final design stages are, so once you've completed construction documents, the next stage is really not about design, but about getting it built. And that's the bid phase. The architect you hire, a big part of their job from the library point of view is they will manage bidding. So they'll help advertise for bids. They will be there to help run the bid opening. And they will help evaluate the bids that come in so that on bid day, you know, it's always surprisingly anticlimactic. People are coming in at the last minute, doing math, submitting bids, you know, 5 minutes before the bid opening. Then everybody sits down and the bids are open and all these numbers are read off and check marks are given for if they have their insurance documentation and their bonding information and all of that stuff. And it's best if nobody says anything like the apparent low bidder is or anything like that, because if a bid isn't compliant with the specs, then it wouldn't even be considered. So it's really best, and what is most typical is all of this information is read off and recorded, and then the architect says, thanks so much for submitting your bids. We will get back with you in a couple of weeks. At that point, everybody goes into overdrive, reviewing the bid information, reviewing references and so forth. And as I said, the architect helps with all of that. Finally, once a contractor is selected, then you go into the construction administration phase. This is where the architect's construction administrator comes into play. For a small firm, you might have an architect who does the whole thing from beginning to end, and some libraries really like that. For a little bit bigger firms, they might have a totally separate person who has tracked the design, and you met them in the interviews, but once it goes into construction or contract administration, they're the ones that will be on the job site making sure that things are complying with the specifications and drawings and representing the library there. That phase is typically costs 20%. And at the end of that, your architect would be fully paid off once your building's done. All right, we're about 2/3 of the way through, and we're about 2/3 of the way through our time. So I offer this as an opportunity for any questions, if anybody has a question. I will point out that there's another webinar that I've done called Preliminary Planning, and it also includes some of this design stuff. There's a little bit of overlap. I'm going to go through it probably a little more quickly here, but the things that do have overlap, I really do think they're that important. When I was looking at these slides, I really thought, should I just not go through some of this again? And I decided I think it's more important for both of these webinars to stand on their own. And if you're getting it twice, I hope you're not bored, but I really do think it's that important. Okay, we will go through several different areas, and as I like to do, we'll start off with a few general things. I don't need to overhit this. Stay focused on library function. I like to remind folks to be careful asking your architect for a unique look or a signature design. Architects are artistic, and they will naturally be bringing their creative self to bear. So I think it's really important to make sure that they understand you're focused on how the building is going to function. If you've got a lot of awards and a neat looking building, it's not going to be helpful if it doesn't work for people who are coming to use the Wi-Fi or apply for a job or go to a meeting or check out books and materials. It needs to function as a library first and foremost. Also, be careful of trendy styling. So you want to not just do the thing that's the most popular today, because it's common for Kentucky libraries to have a lifespan of 50 years and more, 50. So that's a long time. So there's nothing wrong with having something contemporary. Buildings are going to look like the era that they were built in, and there's not a thing wrong with that. But you may not want to have something that is liable to be look dated tomorrow. Look up Googie architecture from the 50s. All right. On items to include, one of the most important things when you're working with your architect on the design is to focus on having an open floor plan. Having a flexible open floor plan that is defined by furnishings rather than walls will make it easy to repurpose the space. So as your library is functioning over all these decades, what we need is going to change, even 50 years ago. So think about that. That's 1975. In 1975, it would have been an extremely forward-thinking library that would have had a computer probably anywhere on the premises. But we have a lot of buildings still functioning that were built in 1975. So you don't want to have a whole lot of little rooms. This is the children's picture book room. This is the children's nonfiction room. This is the teen room. This is the adult nonfiction room. This is the adult fiction room. You're really going to be locked in. Plus, it's going to be hard to supervise. So by designing a building that has a very open floor plan, it's easy to adapt as you go forward in time and as needs change. And it can also be more efficient for staff supervision. I've had architects tell me that compared to their square footage for a public space, libraries actually have a relatively small staffing. And the reason that is workable is that if we are careful to make sure we have an open layout and good sight lines so that we can see the public spaces from the circ desk typically. And more items that can help make for efficient staffing include having a single floor. Folks know from building a house or a church that to build a second floor can be more efficient in those settings than it is to just keep building out. But it's good to remember that for libraries where you're going to have very heavy loads, book shelving is incredibly heavy. Just as a side note, the floor specifications for a library is typically 150 pounds per square foot. A commercial building, not your house, a commercial building would typically be 50 pounds per square foot, possibly less. So our structures need to be very heavily built to allow books to be stored, probably throughout most of the space. Even as we have seen collections change, there's still a lot of books that are circulating. A lot of places still have book circulation increasing, even right now this year. So that is still a big part of our business and has to be accounted for. Having a single floor plan is also more efficient for staff supervision because you can have one or two people, as I said, at the circ desk supervising your main floor, whereas you don't want to have a person or two on various different floors. I've read that the efficiency starts to roll off at about 40,000 square feet. So if you were building a library that was going to be 40,000 square feet or below, you can probably get the most efficient layout for your staffing by putting it on one floor. Once it's getting to be more than an acre, that's an acre under roof more or less. Once it's getting to be more than that, at that point, it might make as much sense to add a level. But having a single floor is really very helpful for a lot of reasons. Also, it's best to have a single entry point. Again, that makes for effective staff supervision. It's just harder to pay attention and to arrange your library when you have two entry doors. Every once in a while, it needs to happen. But a lot of times, even if you're in a more of an urban-y type setting, you can have a visual facade on a main street, but most people are coming in through the parking lot side. So commonly, that's how people would have a single entry. All right. Be sure to prepare for marketing your collection. Include low shelving near the entrance to market new items, AV materials, bestsellers, and programs, whatever it is. So a lot of the libraries now, instead of only having high shelving, which is almost 8 feet tall, they'll have low shelving that could be 4 or 5 or maybe 6 feet tall and spaced wider apart. So the aisles might be 4 or 5 feet wide, and it just has a little bit more of a bookstore feel. And you can put the most popular items there. Try to work with your architect to plan for simple maintenance. This is less of an issue. I think LEDs may have overtaken so much that this may not really be relevant. But in case anybody is going into design, they might want to ask to make sure if there are lamps, bulbs that will be needed for light fixtures, that you have as few different types of bulbs as possible. You don't want to have to buy 100 different lights and keep up with them, so that when something burns out, you've got everything there that you need. Make sure light fixtures can be easily reached with a normal step ladder if they do have a bulb that needs to be changed. So if something's going up over a stairwell or something like that, please make sure it's an LED, because they have the longest lifespan, and you don't want to have to hire a lift or build some complicated scaffold to change the light bulb. It can also be helpful to limit the number of door keys that are needed. Okay, sorry, I'm hacking again. Our next feature, I'm going to rant a little bit about some things to avoid. One of my favorites is skylights. Skylights are beautiful, and I like seeing them in other people's buildings. But skylights are holes in the roof that allow rain and glare to enter your building. Architects, I have a lot of respect for architects. I enjoy working with our architects a lot. But the bottom line is the architect's going to be dealing with your building for a few years. And it's easy for them to feel good about a new product which has been promised to work really well. And I've heard them say, well, we've got new materials, we've got new processes, yada, yada, yada. And that's all true and that's all fine. But for our long lifespan, to have a skylight is very difficult. And most of the libraries that have installed them have had problems with them allowing rain and or blazing, glaring sun to come in through them. So please just do not do it. On items to avoid, you want to be very careful in designing your roof. Low slope roofs are not necessarily a problem. I've got a picture here illustrating a low slope roof. You can see if you look, let's see, I've got a pointer here if I can figure out how to make, okay. You can see if you look at this drain pipe that that's level, and you can see that the roof is going downhill just a little bit. On the back wall, the water runs down that low slope and into a traditional gutter. You can also look back here and see that the roof is sloping down. So I'm a real fan of having water run down a slope, off the edge of the roof, and into a gutter. My dad, as I said, my uncle are plumbers, and they were always happy to tell me what runs downhill. Folks in the military know this also. And in addition to that, water runs downhill. So if you make sure that your roof drains off the edge and into a gutter, it's less likely to be a problem. There are other ways of doing low slope roofs that are very common. For instance, you can have parapet walls. So this is a low slope roof, similar to that one that I just showed you. This black arrow shows the water is running downhill, but when it runs downhill, it hits this wall. And then it has to run sideways to this little hole. I'm not sure where this is. It could be Hardin County, which just had this reworked so that now the water runs off the edge, because they had a lot of problems with this. But as you can see, with this little hole, if that has any problem and gets clogged with leaves, so you just need a bundle of leaves to lay in there, then it will clog those scupper holes and water will start to pond. And if water is ponding on the roof, then any little pinhole will allow the water to start to seep through. So if a roof is sloped and it has minor imperfections, the water will just run downhill and hopefully go away when it hits the gutter. But if you have things like this or interior roof drains, I don't have a picture of that, but an interior roof drain is similar to this, where the water runs down and there's a drain like in the bottom of your bathtub, but it's in the middle of your roof. And if a bundle of leaves or something falls on top of that to plug that, or it just gets clogged with grit and grime, then it's like your bathtub, it'll start to collect water. And again, water can seep through any imperfections in the roof. So I'm a big fan of having water run off the edge. Here are some elements of more complex roof forms that can be hard to keep waterproof. For instance, cupolas, dormers, etc., can be sources of leaks. We have libraries around the Commonwealth that I've dealt with over the years, and they've had problems with dormers and cupolas that it's hard to get those connections to stay waterproof over the life of the building. Complex roofs can have a lot of valleys that are difficult and expensive to replace. I'm going to show you a picture in a minute. And a complex roof can be very difficult to remediate. This picture is of a Kentucky library. It is shared with permission. And I hope you can see it pretty well. But you can see they had a lot of problems. This roof had to be redone when it was only 10 years old because they just couldn't get it to stop leaking. As you can see, it has a cupola. These black arrows are pointing to two dormers. Well, there are more than that, but I have two shown here. So this is a dormer, you know, where it sticks out. They don't have a window there. Sometimes the dormer will have a window on the end. But the section here where there's a vertical wall coming out of that roof can be difficult to keep it waterproof. This red arrow is pointing to a valley. A valley is when two different roof surfaces join to form exactly what the name implies, a valley. It's a low spot in the roof that will accumulate water as it's running downhill. And they can also be very difficult to keep waterproof. This green arrow is showing what is called a hip. And the difference with a hip is it's like the reverse of a valley. but water is running down this one slope this direction and off this other slope a different direction, so it's not accumulating water. I do think this is important, and that's why I'm spending time on it, but you really want to pay attention to your entire roof, how water is going to run off of it. If water runs off the edge and into a gutter and the gutter clogs, then the water runs over the edge of the gutter and onto the ground, but it'll be less likely to go into your building. Okay, enough on that. On we go. Final, yes, this is a repeat if you took my other session, but who doesn't love a picture of the Goose House in Hazard, Kentucky? You know, back in the 50s, people, you know, like this guy had this vision that he wanted to build a building that looked like a goose. And some people call it the Mother Goose House. The windows are egg-shaped. And as you can see, it's got a goose head on it. This caved in a few years ago, but my understanding is they rebuilt it. Thank goodness, because I love the Goose House, but I'm really glad it's not a library. So fun for somebody else. Please don't do it with your library. All right, it's good to be careful about or to avoid rooftop HVAC units. Architects sometimes like to put HVAC units on the roof because that keeps them closer to the spaces they're heating and cooling. And also architects can like things that don't seem unsightly to them, like having a HVAC unit on the ground. The problems with putting HVAC units on the roof are, it's an HVAC unit. It turns off and on. It's doing mechanical things. It's going to vibrate, and that movement can cause leaks. Also, it has to be serviced by people wearing boots, and they're going to be walking back and forth across the roof. So that can cause wear and tear and damage your roof surface. Finally, it makes it a little bit more difficult to service. Personally, I like having HVAC units out on the ground. What's wrong with a good, honest air conditioning unit? People like the building to be warm. They like it to be cold. It's easy to keep up with. You can fix it. If you have security issues or don't want to look at it, build a fence around it. It's important to be careful about controlling lighting. People love to talk about having a view out. People love to talk about using daylight, but it's very important to remember that if you have glare coming from the sun, there's nothing in this world. The most expensive computer monitor or TV is not going to be able to compete with having the sun in your eyes. So lighting needs to be even, not just bright. You need to be very careful about tall windows or arched windows because they can allow glare from the sun, especially on the south and even more especially on the west sides. As the sun's going down in the west during evening hours, which libraries typically always have, the sun is going to get so low that under any window, it's going to be shining in through that west window. The higher the top part of that window is, the sooner the sun is going to start to be visible through that west facing window. Personally, I like windows that aren't taller than about 9 feet above the floor, because if people want to look out, they want to look out, I think, at the world, not look up at the sky. So it's good to have windows that come down low so people can see what's happening outside, but to have them go up really high to me is not very helpful. Certainly, you want to be careful to plan for shading or having frosting on glass if it's going to be very high in the wall at all. This is an example of a library. This is Meade County, and the Meade County Library, now it's been expanded out this way, so it's big. It doesn't look exactly like this, but getting my pointer. You can see there's a little pop-up spot called a clear story, and that clear story allows light to come down into the middle of the building, but it was carefully designed so that it's kind of tall, so there's not many places in the building where you would get direct light coming down and blinding people. But also you can see this is very bright. That has a heavy white frosting on that glazing. The windows, it's the heaviest white frosting they could get up there on those windows. But as you can see, it still provides a nice wash of even light circulating down into their book collection area. So that's an example of a clear story that was nicely done. Y'all can, on any of these specific elements, if you're ever doing a design and you're like, I don't know anything about roofs, I don't know anything about clear stories, don't hesitate to call me. I'm always happy to take a look at plans and see how the water drains. I'm always happy to take a look at the plans and see which windows you're going to want to make sure you're prepared to manage for sunlight. Okay. Whoa, we've got to run through this last little bit. I'm taking too long. When you get your final drawings, check carefully, make sure there are enough outlets. Are the light switches where you need them? Are the correct light fixtures shown? Will the casework, meaning built-in furniture and cabinets, serve your needs? Check the work heights of casework to make sure they're not accidentally too tall or too short. Check every detail you can think of. When you're checking your final drawings, make sure you've determined who will install the voice wiring and the data wiring and any security. Those things could be handled by 3 or 4 different outfits. The elements include conduit, which is pipe in your walls that wires will run through, the wires that run through those conduits, and the connections. It's not all uncommon to have the electrician that's building the building put in the conduit, then have a separate firm come in and pull the wiring after the building is almost done, and then have a third firm come in and plug things in and make sure your routers are all working. So definitely make sure that you've confirmed. Every once in a while, this can kind of get forgotten till a little farther along. If you have AV or a special sound system you're installing, that can also accidentally be forgotten in all of the planning that you do. So you just want to make sure that those, because those are outside contractors, the architect will help coordinate the work, but it's a separate contractor, separate contract that the library will make sure will pay for. All right, we made it through to the end. This is a stained glass window at the Anderson County Library in a Japanese style. We have quite a bit of really nice, highly artistic stained glass, so I like this picture. And it's also an example of having frosted glass that is helping to control the glare that would be coming through. This window's facing the west, so it could become kind of a hot spot. But the stained glass and the frosted glass that's made for the white parts keeps it from being blinding. All right, do we have any questions? We are done time-wise, so I'll move into the last slide. I can stay here for a minute, but I know folks plan for an hour, so if you need to leave, thank you so much for joining us. I apologize for stopping to hack and cough a couple of times, but I appreciate you being here. And I can hang out for a minute to see if we have any further questions.
Thank you, Chris. And while we wait to give people the opportunity to ask questions, I just wanted to remind everybody that the webinar has been recorded and will be